The Libyan revolution brought down Muammar Gaddafi 10 years ago. Now his son is running for president.
After 14 years of silence, a name that once shook the foundations of global power has returned to Libya's political conversation. Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, the son of Muammar Gaddafi, is reportedly rebuilding political networks and positioning himself not as a fugitive, but as a potential leader for Libya's future. The timing couldn't be more significant. Libya remains fractured between rival governments. Foreign powers continue their influence operations. And the Libyan people? They're exhausted from chaos, broken promises, and watching their once wealthy nation reduced to a battleground for external interests. But here comes a name that still carries weight, stirring fear in some, hope in others, and in everyone, deep curiosity. Could Libya find the unity it's desperately seeking? Or are we witnessing history attempt to repeat itself? Let's explore this story, because what's happening in Libya isn't just about one man's political comeback. It's about Africa's relationship with sovereignty, memory, and the courage to chart its own course. Since 2021, Saif al-Islam has been gradually re-emerging in Libyan politics after years of detention and silence. His political team has made public statements, and reports suggest engagement with tribal leaders and former allies. While exact details remain difficult to verify, the pattern is clear: strategic, calculated positioning. For more than a decade, Libya has existed in political limbo. Governments rise and collapse. Foreign envoys promise peace. Militias promise protection. Citizens receive neither. The exhaustion runs deep in a nation that once stood as Africa's wealthiest country. What makes this moment particularly intriguing is the contrast between Libya's current fragmentation and its former coherence. The country that once boasted the highest human development index in Africa now struggles with basic electricity supply. Water infrastructure crumbles. Schools operate sporadically. The disconnect between what was and what is creates a psychological wound that political figures like Saif can address simply by existing, by representing continuity with a time when the state actually functioned. This isn't merely about nostalgia for authoritarian stability, it's about the fundamental social contract. When governments cannot provide security, services, or predictability, citizens begin questioning whether the supposed gains of revolution were worth the tangible losses of daily life. This questioning doesn't make them anti-democratic or pro-dictatorship. It makes them human beings trying to survive in impossible circumstances. The reaction to Saif's political activity is complicated. The Gaddafi era isn't distant history. It's living memory, deeply felt on multiple sides. For many older Libyans, it was when salaries arrived predictably, fuel cost almost nothing, education was free and excellent, and hospitals functioned with modern equipment. Libya had the highest standard of living in Africa. For younger Libyans, the Gaddafi years are more complex, a story told with both pride and bitterness. They inherited both nostalgia and resentments, hearing about what was while living in what is. When Saif speaks about rebuilding Libya on its own terms, about sovereignty without foreign supervision, the words resonate differently than they might elsewhere. After years of external intervention, producing little but instability, many Libyans question whether imported solutions work better than homegrown ones, however imperfect. It's not necessarily praise of the old system. It's that heavy recognition. We've tried everything else and look where we are. Saif's re-emergence forces uncomfortable questions that were never properly answered. Was 2011 the end of authoritarianism or the beginning of a different kind of foreign influence? Did Libya gain freedom or lose control of its destiny? Did intervention bring democracy or fragmentation? Nobody has simple answers. But his return reignites an argument about sovereignty, order, and who writes Libya's next chapter. The question echoing through Libya: if Saif al-Islam is rebuilding networks, who's supporting him? And what does he actually want? Redemption, power, or something else entirely? These questions matter because they reveal how profoundly 2011 transformed not just Libya's government, but its entire social fabric. The intervention wasn't merely regime change, it was civilization disruption. Infrastructure that took decades to build was destroyed in months. Institutional knowledge accumulated over generations evaporated as bureaucrats fled or were purged. Social trust, perhaps the most valuable resource any society possesses, shattered into tribal and regional fragments. Rebuilding from such comprehensive destruction requires more than new elections or constitutional conferences. It requires rekindling belief that collective progress is possible, that investing in Libya's future makes sense. This is where figures connected to the pre-2011 era, whatever their complications, possess psychological advantages. They represent proof that Libya once functioned, that prosperity wasn't fantasy, but lived experience. Political comebacks don't happen by accident, especially not in Libya. Look across Africa right now. There's palpable momentum. Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, nations once written off as dependent are charting independent courses, choosing their own security arrangements and economic policies. They're part of what some call Africa's new sovereignty movement, rejecting asymmetric partnerships that benefit external powers more than African citizens. Libya, once North Africa's wealthy gateway, watches this and remembers, that used to be us. According to reports, Saif hasn't relied on foreign hotel negotiations with diplomats. Instead, he's reportedly engaged with tribal elders and communities, the face-to-face politics that still matters deeply in Libya's cultural context. Tribes remember loyalty and betrayal. If you can rebuild those relationships, you can rebuild political foundations. It's old-school politics, but it's also profoundly African, relational, community-based, rooted in shared history. Western credibility in Libya has essentially collapsed. Every stabilization effort since 2011 has disappointed. So when someone discusses order without occupation, sovereignty without supervision, people listen. It's not blind loyalty. It's pragmatic exhaustion meeting possibility. But there's more than nostalgia here. Saif isn't promising to resurrect his father's Libya exactly. He speaks about evolution, learning from the past. While borrowing the old era's emphasis on self-reliance, he packages it in contemporary language: unity, sovereignty, Pan-Africanism. This positioning matters. Across Africa, Muammar Gaddafi's legacy, whatever one's views, still symbolizes independence and self-reliance. By aligning rhetorically with the Sahel's sovereignty movements, Saif positions himself not as an authoritarian relic, but as part of a continental awakening. The narrative he's constructing: they destroyed my father because he wanted Africa united and independent, but now the same Africa they underestimated is rising again, and Libya will rise with it. It's emotional, political, and strategic. And across parts of the continent, it resonates. Consider the regional context more carefully. When Mali expelled French forces and turned toward different security arrangements, Western media portrayed it as instability. When Burkina Faso's leadership began prioritizing local resource control, it was framed as dangerous nationalism. Yet from within these countries, the narrative sounds completely different. It sounds like agency, like finally having permission to make mistakes on your own terms rather than succeeding according to someone else's script. Libya observes these developments with particular interest because it experienced the opposite trajectory. While the Sahel moves toward greater autonomy, Libya was pushed toward greater external dependence. The contrast is instructive and feeds directly into conversations about whether Libya's post-2011 path was truly chosen or merely imposed with revolutionary rhetoric. Now we must address the serious complications, because Saif al-Islam's return isn't just political, it's moral. The International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for him in June 2011 for alleged crimes against humanity during the uprising. A Libyan court sentenced him to death in 2015 in a widely criticized trial conducted in absentia. He was released from detention in 2017 and granted amnesty by the Tobruk-based government. But the ICC warrant remains active. Legally speaking, he faces serious allegations that have never been adjudicated in a fair, open trial. But here's Libya's reality. Courts barely function. Laws are enforced by whichever militia controls which territory. The line between criminal and political candidate becomes blurry in a state with competing legal systems. To many Libyans and Africans, the ICC appears selective. They've watched Western leaders responsible for interventions never face prosecution, while African leaders are disproportionately targeted. Former US President George W. Bush, former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair, former French President Nicolas Sarkozy all played roles in military interventions, yet face no international warrants. So when The Hague points at Saif, many respond, these are the same powers that destroyed our country, and now they lecture us about justice. It's not endorsement of alleged crimes, it's rejection of what appears as selective, politicized justice. This is where human rights advocates, including many pro-African voices, raise legitimate concerns. How can reconciliation happen without truth? How can Libya move forward if accountability is abandoned? These questions matter deeply and deserve serious consideration, even as Libya seeks stability. The justice dilemma extends beyond individual cases to fundamental questions about post-conflict societies. Rwanda chose a path emphasizing unity over retribution, establishing Gakaka courts that prioritized communal healing. South Africa pursued truth and reconciliation rather than comprehensive prosecutions. These weren't perfect solutions, but they reflected pragmatic recognition that societies emerging from trauma sometimes face impossible choices between ideal justice and functional peace. Libya confronts similar complexity, pursuing accountability through international mechanisms that many Libyans view as politically compromised risks, delegitimizing the justice process itself. Yet abandoning accountability entirely risks perpetuating cycles of violence by signaling that power grants immunity. Threading this needle requires wisdom, cultural sensitivity, and above all, Libyan ownership of whatever process emerges. Let's talk about what drives some of this sentiment. Older Libyans remember when gasoline was practically free, when food subsidies existed, when hospitals had medicine and schools had qualified teachers. Women recall when maternity care was accessible, when the future felt predictable. Then comes the silence, that heavy recognition that these things seem like impossible dreams now. Saif's name taps into that silence. People haven't forgotten the authoritarian aspects, the suppression of dissent, the absence of political freedom, but they desperately miss having a functioning state. Here's the human truth. Trauma changes priorities. After over a decade of war, chaos, and broken promises, even justice can feel like a luxury when your primary concern is whether your children will eat today. This is the delicate space Saif navigates, not denying the past, but reframing conversations. His allies speak of Libyan solutions and African reconciliation, suggesting Libya doesn't need endless punishment to move forward, that real justice now means rebuilding homes and lives. But forgiveness without accountability is fragile. If this potential comeback relies only on nostalgia, it could crumble when old wounds reopen. Libya today isn't a unified country. It's a maze of competing authorities. Two rival governments, each claiming legitimacy, dozens of militias controlling territory, regional power brokers with separate agendas, pretending to want peace while quietly fighting for influence. From available reports, Saif isn't attempting a military takeover. His approach appears slower, more focused on relationships than force, reconciliation over revolution. The Gaddafi name still carries weight in tribal networks. Muammar Gaddafi spent decades mastering tribal politics, balancing competing interests, rewarding loyalty, punishing betrayal. Saif is apparently betting that enough of that social structure remains to rebuild something cohesive. But this isn't just about tribes anymore. He frames his vision in language that resonates continentally, the language of Pan-Africanism, of shared sovereignty, connecting Libya's potential recovery to the broader movement we're seeing across Africa. Because while Western capitals see Libya as a failed state requiring management, many Africans see it as a wounded but powerful nation temporarily brought low, a nation that could recover and rejoin continental leadership. Still, let's be honest about what lies ahead. The practical road is steep. The international community won't simply accept a Gaddafi return without resistance. Inside Libya, militias profiting from chaos won't surrender easily. There will be opposition, complications, setbacks, but there's one factor no one planned for: exhaustion. People are too tired to fight indefinitely, too desperate to care who leads as long as they lead effectively. Sometimes one country's story becomes a mirror for an entire continent. Libya might be that mirror now. When Muammar Gaddafi ruled, Libya wasn't merely a state, it was a statement. It was Africa's financial backbone, funding universities across the continent, supporting the African Satellite Project, pushing for a single African currency backed by gold, something Western financial powers strongly opposed. 14 years later, his son stands on that same soil, looking at a continent quietly rediscovering similar dreams. Unity without permission, sovereignty without apology. If Libya stabilizes, regardless of under whom, it could catalyze shifts beyond domestic politics. Imagine Libya reopening its oil wealth through African-led investment rather than IMF supervision. Libya reconnecting with the African Union as a sovereign partner rather than a failed project. Libya trading directly with neighbors, bypassing exploitative middlemen. That's not just economics, that's psychology. It's Africa remembering it doesn't need external permission to prosper. During Gaddafi's years, African students studied in Tripoli for free. Refugees found work and dignity. Roads were built connecting sub-Saharan countries to the Mediterranean. Was it perfect? No era ever is, but it represented continental ambition. When Libya fell in 2011, that ambition collapsed too. Africa has been moving forward with what feels like a missing limb. Saif's re-emergence feels like that limb beginning to heal, like the continent remembering its full strength. But here's what's critical. If this movement means anything, it must be different. It cannot repeat old patterns of personality-driven, centralized control. It must be more collective, more inclusive, respecting both traditional structures and modern governance needs. The Pan-African revival message only works if other African nations see Libya's recovery as their own reflection, not one man's project. And that's starting to happen in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger forming the Alliance of Sahel States, rejecting dependency, redefining 21st century sovereignty. So perhaps Libya's story is about a continent reclaiming its authorship, not rewriting history or denying mistakes, but finishing a chapter that was violently interrupted, demonstrating that Africa can stumble, learn, and rise without seeking external validation. A question lingers that nobody wants to voice. If Libya truly rises again under indigenous leadership prioritizing African sovereignty, will the same forces that intervened in 2011 allow it? This is where we find Libya standing between what was and what could be. The country seems to hold its breath, not from fear, but from cautious hope mixed with hard-earned skepticism. And this tension isn't confined to Libya. From Bamako to Addis Ababa, people are discussing Libya again, not as a problem requiring intervention, but as a possibility, a potential model for reclaiming sovereignty. After over a decade being called a failed state, Libya is being reconsidered as a potential comeback story. That shift alone represents history attempting to heal. Let's acknowledge the realistic challenges. The country remains scarred. Factions that grew wealthy from chaos won't relinquish control easily. Foreign players won't simply depart. International resistance will be significant. Yet that's exactly what makes this moment potentially powerful. Even under enormous pressure, Libya is starting to sound like Libya again, not as someone else's project, but as a country with its own rhythm, its own vision. You see it in small but meaningful ways. Markets reopening in former battle zones, farmers returning to abandoned regions, social media debates about unity and sovereignty rather than surrender and dependency. It's messy, noisy, imperfect, but it's alive. And after so many years being defined by others, being alive on your own terms is already victory. What happens next depends on whether Libyans can maintain resolve long enough to reclaim what's theirs. It depends on whether Saif al-Islam, or whoever emerges as leadership, can navigate between redemption and accountability. It depends on whether regional and continental support materializes meaningfully. If Libya stabilizes, even partially on its own terms, it won't just be one nation's recovery. It will force acknowledgement that Africa's so-called failures weren't endings. They were learning experiences, preparation for something more sustainable, preparation for genuine sovereignty, for dignity that doesn't depend on external validation, for self-respect that comes from within. Perhaps Saif's return isn't about restoring the past at all. Perhaps it's about reminding Africa of something we once believed but have been conditioned to doubt. That destiny isn't dictated by who invades you or tries to control you. Destiny is determined by who stands back up, by who refuses to accept defeat as permanent, by who remembers their dignity when the world tries to strip it away. As the desert winds sweep across Tripoli, as the sun sets behind those ancient hills that have witnessed empires rise and fall, the question hangs in the air. Is this one man's return to political relevance? Or is this Africa, quietly, defiantly, standing up again? Now I want to hear from you. Do you think Libya is ready to move beyond its divisions? If stability comes through indigenous leadership, will the international community accept it or resist it? How do you see Libya's journey connecting to the broader African awakening in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and beyond? Is this part of one continental movement or separate situations? These aren't rhetorical questions. These are real issues affecting real people, and your perspective matters. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's have a substantive conversation about African sovereignty, about reconciliation and accountability, about what it takes to rebuild a nation. If you found this analysis valuable, hit that like button. If you want more deep analysis of African politics, history, and the stories that mainstream media overlooks, subscribe and turn on notifications. We're committed to the African perspective on African issues, the culture, civilization, history, and evidence of this continent's resilience and power. Thanks for watching. Until next time, stay informed, stay proud, and stay connected to Africa's real story.